Today's little activity is going to be making some bread, and not a particularly festive bread, but there's just something very nice about being indoors, making bread. The weather outside is, well, not frightful, but it's snowing hard, so there's a good reason to be in a nice warm kitchen. I'm going to make a loaf of bread, which I calculated the values on my breadsheet. It's got a lot of different ingredients, but that is how the breadsheet do. So anyway, first we need 6 grams of strong white flour. That might seem like a little silly amount, and indeed it is. The inclusion of this little bit of white flour is only really because the rye bread recipe, which is represented I think as 10% of this loaf, has a bit of white flour in it. We also want some wholemeal, strong wholemeal flour. We want 200 grams of this. Multi-seed bread flour, we're going to have 125 grams. Rye flour, 40 grams. Vital wheat gluten, 44 grams. Oat bran, 25 grams. Okay. And I think I'm supposed to put some flaxseed in here as well, but I have, for some reason, haven't written it down. So back in a moment. Yeah, I thought so. 31 grams of milled flaxseed. I'm using golden flaxseed here because it just looks nicer in the bread. Okay. That is the dry ingredients, minus actually the yeast still needs to go in there. We're going to have a teaspoonful, well, a heaped teaspoonful of yeast, but that's actually about how much is left in this packet. I've decanted the rest of it into an airtight tin. That was the last little bit that wouldn't fit. About a teaspoonful of salt. And then I'll just stir those to combine. A lot of people worry that maybe the salt might kill the yeast, but it would do if you were going to put it into the starter. So if you've got the kind of yeast that needs activation or blooming, you don't want to put the salt in that small batch of wet ingredients. But in a big bread mix like this, that amount of salt will not inhibit the yeast activity. Okay, that's the dry ingredients nicely mixed. Now it's time for the wet. 16 grams of oil. I'm going to use olive oil. A neutral vegetable oil would also work here. And then 341 grams or 341 ml of lukewarm water. This is just blood heat, so comfortable to put my hand in. Don't want it too hot or else it might kill the yeast. Right, slowly now, so we don't overshoot, because this is one ingredient that you really can't take out. There we go. Now mixing time. Just going to use the dough hooks on my little hand mixer here. Now, one of the reasons I like to use this jug for mixing bread is we can actually have a look underneath. You can see there's still some dry flour down the bottom there. So let's get down there and mix that in properly. Looking pretty good. This now needs to go off to the airing cupboard. That is the cupboard where we keep the hot water tank for its initial fermentation. And we'll come back when that's doubled in size. And while that's happening, I think we're going to give some love and attention to poor little Eva. She really doesn't like the cold weather, so she's having a duvet day today. Okay, that's been only about an hour in the airing cupboard, and it's hugely risen. I might have been a little bit too generous with the yeast. We'll get this out onto a well-floured board. I didn't do very much kneading and mixing before the first fermentation, because there's really not a lot of point. The gluten will develop just in the presence of moisture. You know, you can, if you want to make bread fast, you can knead before the initial fermentation. I don't bother generally these days, just because it's easier not to. So it's quite a loose dough. Now we will knead though, because what I want to do is build up a little bit of structure here. Well, we actually want to make sure that we've evened out all of the little holes, all the little gas pockets in there. So fold and push like that. Now after a while this dough will become less sticky as the gluten gets going in here. I mean, partly because also I am working in a bit of extra flour, but also just because the gluten is turning into a resistant sort of gel. If you tried to add more water now, it would just run off. Now this bread's going to be rolled out. So I'm going to roll it out into a long, thin strip like this. I'm not going to put any extra flour on the top, so this might stick to the rolling pin a little bit. There is a reason why I'm not adding flour to the top now, because, well, I'll explain in a moment. So now I'm actually just going to brush this top surface with a little bit of water just to moisten it and make it kind of sticky again, because we're now going to have pumpkin seeds. No idea what quantity or weight of pumpkin seeds that is, but if you freeze the frame you could count them if you're so disposed. However, I'd say that's probably about 25-30 grams of pumpkin seeds. This part might be tricky because if you're following along, because this is my stinging nettle seeds that I collected back in the summer. I'm just going to have a little sprinkling of those on there as well. Not too much. We've got to make sure that what we don't create here is a Swiss roll. I don't want this to fail to stick back together, because the next step is to roll it up. Now when this bakes, I want the bread to bond to the bread, so I've got to be a little bit careful about how much stuff I add in the middle there, whereas we find that we get great big voids. We might still end up with that as well anyway. So now I've got to find a tin to put that in. So I picked a tin that is about probably twice the volume of that knocked back dough. A lot of the gas is now knocked out of that dough, so that will now prove, and it will double in size before we bake it. So I've picked a tin that's maybe a little bit less than twice the size of the bread. And I'm just going to give this a really good coating of oil on the inside, especially on the sides and ends, because if it sticks to the side of the tin, it may have trouble rising. Okay, right, there we go. So just making sure that the curly ends of the bread are turned down. That's going to go into that tin, back in the airing cupboard now for probably another hour, until it's level with the top of the tin, or maybe a little bit proud. We're not quite done for now though, because I want to make a tiger top on that loaf. I've got about 50 ml of warm water and then rice flour. I don't know how much this is going to take, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm just going to mix in rice flour until we get a kind of semi-liquid paste. So I think that's probably going to be about 4, maybe a bit more, 5, 6 heaped teaspoonfuls. Yeah, that feels about right. So we've got a gluey paste like that. Jenny's just come home for a walk in the snow. Into that we'll have just about half a teaspoonful of yeast. Right, mix that in. Now I'm going to leave that on top of this mat because that may well foam up and overflow the glass. Maybe I should put it in a bigger container. Oh, this lived dangerously. Okay, that took about an hour and a half, but the bread has just risen above the rim of the tin now. This stuff, well, it hasn't exactly bubbled, but it has foamed a little bit, so it's got a, you can actually hear a kind of hollow texture. There are little bubbles in there. Not that that matters too much, it just means the yeast is working. Now, sesame oil, about a tablespoonful, about half a teaspoonful of salt. We have just a little bit more sesame oil. This is toasted sesame oil. So this and the yeast and the salt are what gives tiger bread its very delicious flavour on the crust. So now this paste, this mixture, just need to brush it onto the top of this bread. I've got way more here than I actually needed, so I might just have to make some more loaves of bread this afternoon. This is rice flour, sesame, yeast, salt mixture. And what this does, because it's rice flour, it doesn't cling together like the gluten does in wheat flour, and so this will crack when the bread expands a little bit, and it will form a sort of crackly crust. Oh, missed a spot. So, and the oven is now preheating to 220 Celsius fan. As soon as it's preheated, I'll turn it back down to 210 or so. That just means that when we open the door to put the bread in, we don't lose the target temperature. Now also, before I bake this bread, this never goes well for me, but I'm going to try it anyway. I've got a really sharp blade. Just going to slash the top of the loaf like that. In the past, whenever I've done this, that causes it to sink, so we'll see what happens this time. In the bottom of this oven there is a shallow tray, so the first thing I'm going to do, a glass of water goes in there to create steam, in goes the bread, and now we turn the temperature down to 210, which it's managed to maintain, because if you look on the temperature dial we can see the red thing's gone off, so that means we haven't lost that target temperature of 210 Celsius. Okay, that's had a total of 35 minutes in the oven. It didn't spring very much, and so these slashes in the top haven't opened up. That's just a problem I seem to always have with bread, but nevertheless, I'm sure we've got a nice loaf of bread here. Let's just have a look at the underneath. This is literally straight out of the oven, so it's boiling hot still, but we've got to be really careful. Anyway, we've got the crackly tiger top. Not very tiger, but anyway, now we've got to leave that for at least half an hour to let that cool completely before we can slice it. Okay, this is cooled down now. Still nice and crusty on top. Let's cut a couple of slices and see what kind of a loaf we've got here. Lovely. So we've got a discernible spiral of pumpkin seeds and nettle seeds in there. Lovely, soft crumb, crispy tiger crust. Not sure I've ever actually been offered anything like this in a shop. So, you know, one of the joys of making bread is you get to make it exactly the way you want it. We should have a little taste, shouldn't we? Butter's a little bit hard still. Not because it's been in the fridge, but because the house is not that warm. It's snowing outside. Right, let's give this a taste. That's quite a generous slathering of butter there. Actually, it's the crust I want to taste here. There is just such a lot going on inside this bread. This spiral of pumpkin seeds, the nettle seeds, the flax, the multigrain, the rye, all of the nutty, wheaty flavour. I think it's one of the best things about making your own bread. It's not just because the process is kind of miraculous, but also you get to have your bread the way you really like it. So I'll be serving some slices of this bread along with dinner tonight, which is a lamb and barley stew, and just buttered bread on the side will be fantastic. So thanks for joining me in the kitchen to make bread today, and I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for the next door in the Advent calendar.